This is the Saez Sash Door Company, kit number 2 from Campbell scale models. There's also a kit number 1. The two kits go together and they're connected by an air ventilator duct. This kit is a little bit difficult to build and a little more difficult to paint, and you'll see why later in the video. However, the kit is really well engineered, so good work to the team at Campbell Scale Models who put this together. There's basically 3 separate buildings, and the parts for each building are in separate bags. The instructions are really clear. I didn't find any mistakes in the instructions. There are really good scale diagrams in the instructions, and including an exploded diagram that was very helpful. The instructions are printed in kind of a small font, so I had them reprinted larger so I could read them better. I paid $125 for this on eBay, and I saw recently that it sold for about $50. Well, that's how it goes sometimes. Campbell Scale Models has a pretty wide range of kits. Most of them are kind of plain looking, which is kind of to say that they're actually pretty realistic looking compared to some of the stuff from like fine scale miniatures where the buildings are actually pretty wacky but maybe not very realistic. So this building looked like one of the more interesting buildings, and that's why I selected it. Construction starts with the lumber shed and the interior wall studs. The wood in this kit has a lot of splinters, so you really want to rub it with some fine steel wool. I was pretty careful about doing that on most of the sticks in this kit. Here I'm assembling the front of the lumber shed over the scale diagrams. I use a piece of parchment to prevent gluing the assembly to the diagram. In the past I haven't really worried about that, but these instruction sheets have printing on both sides, so I really didn't want to destroy them. You really want to make sure that you cut all of the sticks to the exact length and get them nice and square. Here you can see how the lumber shed is coming together. The pieces are pretty fragile, and you want to make sure you get everything square. This is the part of the build that gets a little bit challenging. You really want to make sure that you get all of your pieces cut to the exact same length, at least as much as possible. And that way all the internal supports are going to fit together. I put a piece of masking tape over the front of the building to mark the position of the supports that run front to back. At this point, all the interior supports are complete and it's time to attach the loading dock. It almost makes your eyes go batty trying to look at this thing. The loading dock is a pre-cut piece of wood with the boards scribed into it. Now it's time to add the floorboards, and conveniently these are all pre-cut, so all you have to do is glue them in place. The instructions are written as if you have pre-stained all of the wood before the assembly. Of course, I did not do that. So before I go any further with the assembly of the wood shed, I need to paint the interior because I will not be able to access the interior once all of the supports are in place. I started painting with gray enamel from a spray can, and then over that I used folk art barnwood. Now I'm covering it with a black Dr. Benz weathering stain. Later I will use this same technique on the exterior of the building, and it's going to be a problem. But for the interior that is not very visible, I'm going to leave it as it is. Since I wasn't really happy with the appearance of the black, now I'm applying a brown Dr. Benz stain. I really should have just started over, but it's so dark inside the building that you really can't tell. Here are some of the internal lumber supports. I figured it'd be easier just to dip those into the stain and let it dry. Here you can see the final result on the interior. The building is pretty dark inside, so you can't really see it in the final building anyway. But now it's time to add the rafters for the roof. Well, I think I was supposed to put the shelves in before the rafters, and obviously I didn't do that. I ended up having to cut some of the longer shelves apart and inserting them in pieces. But what really makes the assembly difficult is that the shelves have vertical posts which are supposed to line up with the rafters. So you have 3 rows of shelves, each with vertical posts. So if you don't get your rafters in exactly the right position, or if you don't build your posts in exactly the right position, they won't line up. It's not really a big deal if they don't, because it's really not visible once the building's assembled, but it's just something that you want to get as accurate as possible while you're doing it. Now it's time to assemble what they call the overflow shed, and of course that starts with bracing. The framing for the barn door is just a piece of cardstock that you cut out. These are the walls for the little office building. They recommend that you scrape away the bottom of the wood to make it look like the wood is rotted. I'm doing that with a razor blade. Here you can see the final effect. This is another tricky part of the build. For the hopper, they give you 1 sheet of rectangular wood, and you need to cut out these kind of pyramid-shaped pieces from that sheet. So I'm doing that with a razor blade. The trick here is to get all of the pyramid pieces as close to the same size as possible, and precision really counts in this case. This part of the assembly of the hopper is where your careful cutting pays off. If you're actually going to build this kit and you kind of mess up this area, it doesn't look that great, don't worry about it, just keep going. This isn't really very visible in the final building anyway. This is the roof for the hopper, and you're supposed to cover it with tar paper that they give you. But I'm using tar paper from Builders and Scale because I had it left over from a previous project. The tar paper with the kit was pretty thin. It was almost like black tissue paper. They give you these taper dowels from which you're supposed to cut legs for the hopper. The dowels are way longer than they need to be. So here I am cutting out a stick to use as the actual height for the hopper legs. It'll be my main template, then I'll cut the other dowels to that length. You glue wood strips around the top of the hopper and they stick up a little bit and they act as boundaries for the roof. So here I'm attaching the roof within those boundaries. Another tricky part of the build, which I did not show, is attaching the support ribs to the bottom of the hopper. It's tricky because you want to get the angles right, but again, they're not very visible in the final building. So really, the most difficult parts of this build aren't even really very visible in the final building. Now it's time to attach the legs. This is my contraption for holding the hopper in place as I attach the legs, and then holding the legs in place as the glue dries. Yeah, typically the least exciting part of any build is shingling the roof. So the shingles come on strips, and there's a gummy backing on the back of the strips. You get it wet, and then you glue the shingles down to the cardboard that they give you. Very conveniently, they do give you horizontal lines on the cardboard to help keep the shingle line straight. I run the shingle strips over a sponge, and then I stick them to the cardboard. Yes, I seem to show this in every video, but you never know who's going to be watching for the first time. This is the roof for the overflow building, and it gets tar paper, and again I'm using tar paper from Builders and Scale. I cut it into strips 3 scale feet wide, and I glue it with a slight overlap. I'm gluing it on using spray adhesive. These are the posts that support the catwalk over the hopper. They're supposed to be cut from the tapered dowels, but I kind of screwed that up. So here I'm making my own dowels out of square pieces of wood. Now we get to the exterior painting. I started by painting everything with a gray enamel from a spray can. Now I'm painting over that with folk art barnwood. I'm really trying for a realistic appearance on this build. You can decide whether I achieve that or not. Well, if you watched my previous videos, you might guess that the next step was going to be Vallejo dark gray wash, but you'd be wrong. Here I am trying the Dr. Benz black weathering stain, but I'm really not going to be very happy with it. The stain is in a base of isopropyl alcohol, and the isopropyl alcohol is dissolving the acrylic paint that's already on the building. So it's going to kind of make a mess. The other problem is how well it flows. I don't know what Vallejo puts in their washes, but the flow on those washes is amazing. The Dr. Benz flow is nowhere near as good, but it's a lot cheaper, so I wanted to give it a try. I think the Dr. Benz stain are less suited to going over coats of paint and more suited to going over the raw material like wood or plaster. Just look at that mess. That is totally not the look I was going for. So yeah, after realizing the mess I made on the hopper using the Dr. Benz stain, I decided to use the Vallejo dark gray wash on the overflow building. I also used the wash on the rafters for the woodshed, although those probably aren't even visible at all. Well, if you've watched my previous videos, you might guess that the next step is a dry brush of Vallejo Silver Gray, and this time you'd be right. So yes, I really use about the same 4-step process for painting all of my old buildings. Well, I wanted some color somewhere on the build, so for the overflow shed, I decided to add some Americana Rookwood Red. I'm applying that with a sponge. I use natural sponges that you can get at any art supply store. I know some people prefer other types of sponges, such as grout sponges. There's really nothing like the look of distressed red paint on an old barn. The sponge only hits high areas, so I have to use a brush to get in along the door runner. Well, the hopper looked pretty bad, so I painted over the Dr. Ben stain with barnwood, and then I went back and did a wash of Vallejo dark gray. Now I'm doing a dry brush of some brown. Well, if there's anything more tedious than shingles, I guess it would be rafter tails. So here we are. Most of my early modeling was armor, so this is about the equivalent of assembling individual track links. Of course, you have to pre-paint the rafter tails, and for the red building, I did that with a sponge. With the roof attached, I have to go back and add the cap strip of shingles. I really wasn't sure how I wanted to paint the shingle roof, so it started out with gray enamel from a spray can, and now I'm using a Vallejo dark brown wash. Now I'm throwing in a little bit of dark gray wash just for variety. I'm also hitting the ends of the rafter tails with it. For the overflow shed, the roof got some gray dry brushing, and now I'm going to apply a wash of Americana traditional burnt umber. Now the shingle roofs and walls get a very light airbrush of Vallejo ash gray. And now another very light overspray of Vallejo dirt. Now I'm using Vallejo light olive. This gives it a little bit of a mossy or lichen look. The goal here is to build up a real depth of color using washes, dry brushing, and an airbrush. These airbrush effects are pretty subtle, so if you don't have an airbrush, it's not a big deal to leave these steps out. Now, of course, it's time for weathering powders, followed by an acrylic sealer. So I'm back to dry brushing some Vallejo silver gray, and watch what happens here. Well, the hopper rolled into the little pool of paint and got a blob of paint on the front. So now I have to get rid of it. So the first thing I tried to do was kind of dry brush it away, but that didn't work, obviously. So now I'm going to use some water to try and get that off, but since it's dry brushing, the paint is already dry. So finally, what I did was I used isopropyl alcohol. Now that removed the paint, And because I had sprayed the piece with an acrylic sealer, it did not remove the paint underneath. So it ended up looking okay. Anyway, this is all happening because after applying the airbrushing and the weathering powders, it took away some of the gray streaks that I really like that really makes it look like old aged wood. So I'm adding those back. Now you might think that everything looks too gray or too black, but that is characteristic of the look of old barns and old buildings in this part of the country. The kit includes several bundles of different sizes of pre-cut lumber for filling the lumber shed. Placing them is a little tedious, but once you get the first in, the rest are kind of easy to add on top of the pile. Some I did in stacks, most of them I did haphazardly. The last step is to add some AK Interactive moss deposits around the base of the building. This is an enamel product. Where I live in the Midwest, a lot of old buildings have moss and lichen on them. I suppose if you're modeling a desert environment, this probably is not realistic. I guess you could just use a light wash of green paint, but I like to try new products. I do think there's something in here that makes it a little bit different than just a wash, but if you didn't want to spend the money on the special product, you could just try a wash. Overall, I was pretty happy with how this kit turned out. There were a couple times when I really thought I wasn't going to be able to save it, but the final results were better than I expected.
I love the way you walk. I love the way you walk. I'm crazy about your walk. I love the way you walk. You my babe, I got my eyes on you. I like the way you switch. 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 You my babe, I got my eyes on you. You got dimples in your jaw. 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 You my babe, I got my eyes on you.